The warm golden hues of the evening sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Rosendale Bistro, an upscale dining spot in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia. The soft melody of a live pianist blended with the rhythmic clinking of silverware, setting the tone for a night of luxury and indulgence. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays filled with aged wines and delicately plated entrees. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, the kind shared between powerful executives closing million-dollar deals and well-dressed families celebrating special occasions. At that moment, the entrance door swung open, letting in a small draft of cool air. Stepping inside was an elderly black woman, her presence gentle yet commanding in a way that made a few patrons glance up instinctively. She was dressed modestly yet elegantly, wearing a deep burgundy coat with intricate floral embroidery on the sleeves. A simple black leather handbag rested in the crook of her arm, her hands covered in gloves that hinted at a refined upbringing. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly pinned back, revealing a face marked with wisdom, dignity, and years of experience. Her movements were measured, steady, each step taken with the grace of someone who knew exactly who she was, yet expected nothing from anyone. Near the hostess stand, a young blonde woman named Ashley glanced up from her reservations list. Her well-rehearsed smile faltered just for a second, almost imperceptible. But there. She smoothed down her neatly pressed blazer and straightened up, as though instinctively adjusting herself before speaking. "Good evening, ma'am," Ashley greeted, her voice polite but distant. "Do you have a reservation?" The elderly woman offered a soft smile, her dark eyes warm but sharp. "Yes, dear." Under the name Mrs. Evelyn Carter, Ashley's fingers skimmed down the list. Her brows twitched slightly when she found the name. Her reservation was indeed there. And yet there was a moment's hesitation, as if she was debating something internally. After a brief pause, she finally gestured toward the seating area, though her voice lacked the same warmth she had offered the previous guests. "Right this way, ma'am." Mrs. Carter followed without complaint, though she noticed everything. She saw the way Ashley led her toward a table near the kitchen doors, away from the main dining area, where the well-dressed patrons were seated in cozy booths and well-lit corners. It was a subtle thing, but she had seen it before, many times. Her seat was small, slightly wobbly, pressed near a side station where waiters rushed back and forth, barely sparing her a glance. Still, Mrs. Carter did not protest. Instead, she settled into her chair gracefully, her posture unwavering. She had come here for a reason. She unfolded the menu and began to scan the options. But something was off. Minutes passed, then several more. She watched as waiters weaved between tables, smiling, laughing, pouring fresh glasses of wine for guests who had arrived long after she did. Yet her table remained untouched. Her waiter had yet to arrive, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. A few tables away, a young woman in a navy dress leaned toward her fiancé, whispering something behind the rim of her wine glass. Her partner, a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, cast a glance in Mrs. Carter's direction, his brows knitting together. Another diner, a middle-aged man adjusting his watch, followed the woman's gaze before shifting uncomfortably in his seat. It was subtle, not loud, not overt. But it was there, the unspoken question, why hadn't she been served yet? Just as the thought crossed their minds, a waiter finally approached. Tall and lean, with sleeves neatly rolled up, the young man, Ryan according to his name tag, stopped at Mrs. Carter's table. But instead of a warm, professional greeting, he barely glanced at her. His smile was tight, forced, his tone clipped. "Sorry for the wait. We're really busy right now," he said briskly. "I'll be back in a bit." And just like that, he was gone. Mrs. Carter nodded gracefully, offering a quiet, "Thank you." She did not call after him. She did not argue. She simply waited. But someone else had been watching. From a dimly lit booth near the bar, a man in his early 40s had been observing the entire exchange. His sharp, calculating eyes flickered between Ryan's hurried movements and his mother's untouched table. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was happening. And he wasn't just any diner. He was Daniel Carter, the owner of this restaurant. And Mrs. Carter, she wasn't just any guest. She was his mother. But Daniel did not move, not yet. He wanted to see just how far this would go. Mrs. Carter remained seated, her expression unreadable, but her patience unwavering. She had spent decades enduring moments like this, not just in restaurants, but in offices, stores, and waiting rooms where her presence was acknowledged only when it was convenient. She was in no rush, but the same could not be said for those watching. Across the restaurant, Daniel Carter's fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood of his table, his mind calculating every detail. He had spent years building Rosendale Bistro, shaping it into one of the city's most prestigious dining establishments. It was his restaurant. And yet here she was, sitting in a neglected corner like an afterthought. His mother. Daniel took a slow sip of his water, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He was watching, measuring, waiting. He knew his mother well. She was not someone who needed defending. She had spent her life handling situations like these with quiet grace. But that didn't mean he wouldn't act. He just needed to see how deep this problem ran. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Carter's table, the minutes stretched on. The couple nearby exchanged glances, their hushed conversation mirroring the growing discomfort spreading through the room. Something wasn't right. Even the pianist, who had been effortlessly moving through a soft melody, seemed to falter for a moment, sensing the shift in atmosphere. And yet Mrs. Carter remained poised. A different waiter, a young woman with dark brown curls pulled into a ponytail, passed by carrying a tray of drinks. As she set them down at a neighboring table, her gaze briefly flickered toward Mrs. Carter's empty place setting. Her brows furrowed. She hesitated. Then, just as she turned slightly toward Mrs. Carter's table, Ryan returned. The air around them tightened. This time, he didn't even offer an excuse. Instead, he let out a barely concealed sigh, his lips pressing into a thin line as he placed a napkin and utensils in front of her. "Still deciding?" he asked, his voice holding the same dismissive edge as before. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, as though this was her fault, as though she had been the one causing the delay. Mrs. Carter closed the menu gently, her fingers smoothing over the polished cover. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "I'm ready to order whenever you are, young man." Ryan nodded, but the tension in his shoulders made it clear. He didn't want to be here. As he pulled out his notepad, he barely made eye contact, his posture stiff, impatient. But before she could speak, a familiar voice interrupted. "Excuse me." Ryan turned slightly, only to see the same young woman from before. The other server who had passed by Mrs. Carter's table earlier. Her arms were crossed, her brown eyes narrowed. "Why hasn't this table been served properly?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. Ryan blinked. But before he could come up with an excuse, another voice joined in. A different patron. The woman in the navy dress at the center of the room shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to stay silent. "Yeah, we've been here for less time, and we already got our drinks and appetizers," she murmured to her fiancé. "Something's off." Her fiancé nodded, his expression darkening. Ryan swallowed hard. For the first time that evening, he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. Eyes were on him now, not just his managers, not just his co-workers. The customers were watching. And still, Daniel Carter did not move. Not yet. He wanted to see just how far this would go, because if there was one thing his mother had taught him, it was that actions reveal character more than words ever could. And Ryan was revealing exactly who he was. The weight of the evening still lingered in the air. Even as the soft hum of conversation slowly returned to the restaurant, the energy had shifted. The servers moved more attentively. The diners glanced toward Mrs. Carter's table with a mix of respect and quiet thoughtfulness. Ryan was gone, but his actions weren't forgotten. Daniel remained by his mother's side, his sharp features still taut with lingering frustration. He had wanted to let things unfold, to observe, but watching her endure the silent mistreatment, knowing she would never complain, it had made his blood boil. Mrs. Carter, however, remained as poised as ever. She took a delicate sip of water, now freshly poured by Dana, the manager, who had taken over the table herself. "I truly apologize for everything, Mrs. Carter," Dana said, her voice filled with sincerity. "This isn't who we are, and it won't happen again." Mrs. Carter gave a gentle nod. "I believe you, dear." But that didn't mean she would forget. Daniel finally took his seat across from her, his fingers pressing lightly against his temple. His frustration hadn't settled completely. He knew what had just happened, and so did the people around them. At a nearby table, the young woman in the navy dress and her fiancé were still whispering. She shook her head, exhaling sharply. "That was disgusting," she muttered. "I can't believe he treated her like that." Her fiancé nodded, running a hand along his jaw. "And how often does this happen to people who don't have someone powerful watching over them?" Daniel heard it, and it stuck. Because it was the truth. The staff learns a lesson. At the back of the restaurant, Dana had gathered the remaining servers, her expression serious, firm. "Let's be clear about something," she said, her tone commanding but calm. "Every guest who walks into this restaurant, no matter who they are, what they look like, or how they're dressed, deserves respect, no exceptions." Maya, the waitress who had stood up for Mrs. Carter, crossed her arms. It was obvious what he was doing. The way he barely looked at her, that wasn't an accident. A few other waiters shifted uncomfortably. They had seen it, they had known it, but no one had spoken up, except Maya. Dana's lips pressed together. "And that's the problem. If you see something like this happening, you don't just ignore it. You step in, you say something." Her gaze flickered across the staff, making sure they understood. "Because if you don't, you're part of the problem." The group nodded slowly, some looking more ashamed than others. Daniel and Mrs. Carter's final words back at the table, Daniel let out a deep breath, glancing at his mother. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted. Mrs. Carter smiled softly. "No, you did the right thing. You let him reveal his own character. That's more powerful than confronting someone too soon." Daniel thought about that for a moment. And maybe she was right, but still he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just tonight. His mother had lived a life where this kind of treatment was far too common. And if she had simply walked out quietly, said nothing, let it go, would anyone have even noticed? A reminder for everyone. As Mrs. Carter finished her meal, the last of the tension seemed to dissolve. Dana had personally ensured that she was given the same level of service as any other guest, if not better. But the lesson lingered, not just for the staff, not just for Daniel, but for everyone in that restaurant, because they had seen it. They had witnessed what happened when someone was treated as less than simply because of an assumption, a prejudice, an unspoken bias, and now they had a choice. Would they ignore it next time, or would they speak up? Daniel knew the answer because tonight he had made sure that silence wasn't an option. The night was beginning to wind down, tables were clearing, the ambient chatter softened, and the pianist had returned to his melody, though the notes carried a different weight now. Daniel sat across from his mother, watching as she took the final sip of her tea. She looked as composed as ever, unshaken, unwavering, just as she had always been. But Daniel was not the same. Tonight had opened his eyes to something he had always known, but had never been forced to confront so directly in his own restaurant. His mother, the strongest woman he knew, the one who had taught him the value of respect, dignity, and hard work, had been treated as if she didn't belong in a place that he had built. And if it had happened to her, how many others had left quietly without him ever knowing? A conversation that stuck with the guests. At a nearby table, the young woman in the navy dress leaned across to her fiancé. "I can't stop thinking about it," she murmured. "It's one thing to hear about this kind of thing happening, but to see it? To actually watch someone just act like she didn't matter?" Her fiancé nodded slowly. "It makes you wonder. How often do we look the other way?" The woman sighed, stirring the last of her drink. "I don't know, but next time I won't." A quiet exit, a powerful message. Mrs. Carter folded her napkin and set it aside. She didn't need recognition, didn't need grand gestures. She simply stood, adjusting the sleeves of her coat before reaching for her purse. Daniel stood as well, walking to her side as she turned toward the exit. Every step she took was noticed. Waiters stole quick glances. Guests who had witnessed the confrontation looked on with quiet admiration. Even Dana, the manager, watched with a thoughtful expression, as if still processing the gravity of the lesson they had all learned. Daniel opened the door for her, and she stepped outside into the cool evening air. For a moment they stood there, just outside the glow of the restaurant's windows. "You did good tonight, son," she said softly. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." Mrs. Carter placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What matters isn't that it happened, Daniel. What matters is how you responded." He looked at her, his jaw tight, his thoughts still heavy. "You gave everyone in there something to think about. That's how change happens." And deep down, Daniel knew she was right. Inside the restaurant, Dana gathered the remaining staff for a final meeting before closing. Her expression was serious, firm. "Tonight was a wake-up call," she began. "Not just for Ryan, but for all of us. This restaurant is supposed to be a place where everyone is treated with respect, and that starts with how we serve them." Maya, the waitress who had spoken up earlier, crossed her arms. "It's about the culture we create. It's easy to pretend these things don't happen, but they do." A few others lowered their gazes, looking guilty. They had all seen it. And yet, only one person had spoken up. Dana exhaled sharply. "From now on, I expect every single person on this team to hold themselves and each other accountable, because this can't happen again." The team nodded, some more solemnly than others. They understood now. Because tonight they had seen what happens when someone chooses silence. And more importantly, what happens when someone chooses to act. As Daniel watched his mother step into the waiting car, he felt something shift inside him. Tonight wasn't just about one mistake. It was about the countless unseen moments like this, the ones that go unnoticed, unspoken, unchallenged. But not anymore. Because tonight, Ryan had been held accountable. The staff had learned a lesson. And the guests who had seen it all, They had left with a story they wouldn't forget, one that might just change the way they saw the world. As Daniel turned back toward Rosendale Bistro, the weight in his chest didn't feel as heavy, because he knew one thing for sure. The next time someone like his mother walked through those doors, they would never be ignored again. And to you watching, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have looked away? These moments happen every day. They aren't always obvious, they aren't always loud, but they are there. And how we respond defines who we are. Let this story be a reminder to always choose dignity, respect, and action. If you believe in treating people with kindness and fairness, hit the like button. Share this story to help spread awareness, because these conversations matter. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications, because together we can make a difference. Thank you for watching.